Welcome to our deep dive into jazz fusion. We're using excerpts from a paper on Miles Davis and some poetic reflections on music. They were originally in Spanish, but we have translations. I think the goal is to understand jazz fusion. What is it? How did it emerge? And why should we care in 2024? Oh, and get this, we might learn how one musician basically like single-handedly redefined a genre known for having no boundaries.
Yeah, jazz fusion, it's a really tricky concept, right?
Yeah,
Maybe instead of a category, it's more like a way of thinking about music,
yeah.
a philosophy. It's about really pushing jazz, going beyond the limits and bringing in all these influences from other genres like rock, funk, even sometimes classical music.
Okay, so before we get to breaking all the rules, let's lay the groundwork. What makes jazz? Our sources talk about swing, blue notes, they mention call and response patterns, and also polyrhythms, those complex rhythms that make jazz so, I don't know, rhythmically exciting. Could you maybe break those down a bit for our listener?
Sure. So swing. Swing is this really unique rhythmic feel. It gives jazz this energy, makes it move forward. It's like a slight push and pull against the beat, a little looseness, but it creates this forward momentum. Then you've got blue notes. Blue notes are notes that are bent, played a bit lower than their standard pitch. It adds this soulful, bluesy quality. And call and response, that's like a conversation in music, right? One instrument or musician will play a phrase, and then another one responds. It creates a really dynamic back and forth. Then we have polyrhythms, and those are the multiple rhythms happening at the same time. It adds this whole other layer of complexity. Rhythmically, it can be really challenging, but also really exhilarating.
Wow, it sounds like a lot's happening. So wouldn't all of this stuff be in, like, the musical score? I mean, what makes jazz so different?
Improvisation. Improvisation is like the heart of jazz. It's all about being creative, spontaneously, musicians responding to each other right there in the moment. And a lot of early jazz musicians, they didn't have formal training, so they really relied on their ears and their intuition. So improvisation wasn't just like a choice, it came out of necessity.
Yeah.
And it's wild to think that this way of having a musical conversation, became such a core part of the genre.
Yeah. And it's that spirit, that pushing boundaries that leads us to jazz fusion eventually, right?
Mm.
Now, our sources talk about Miles Davis as like the key figure in this evolution. He was a total innovator even before the fusion era with albums like Kind of Blue, which was a big modal jazz exploration, and then Sketches of Spain with Spanish influences. He was always moving, never stayed in one place musically.
Exactly. But to really get how jazz fusion blew up,
Right.
we got to look at what led to it. We got to look at smooth jazz and rock jazz. They kind of paved the way for what Davis did, his radical experiments. So smooth jazz, with its electric instruments, made jazz more accessible, wider audience, heard it on the radio more. What do you think about how that impacted the scene?
I think it's complicated, like a double-edged sword, right? It helped popularize jazz for sure, but it also maybe risked diluting that improvisational spirit, catering to more commercial tastes. It's fascinating how a format like radio can influence how artists express themselves.
Definitely. And then we have rock jazz, which took those same electric instruments, but like injected them with energy and power. It's like that wall of sound in rock music.
Mm.
They brought that intensity, the volume to jazz,
Hmm.
made it bolder, more aggressive. It's almost like a preview of what Davis would do with fusion.
So we have this mix brewing, the improvisation from traditional jazz, the accessibility of smooth jazz, and then the raw energy of rock jazz. It's all pointing to Miles Davis, like it had to happen.
Yeah, it's true. And the thing is, Davis didn't just like blend these things together. He went beyond that. He created something totally new, groundbreaking.
So we left off talking about smooth jazz and rock jazz, those stepping stones. Seems like Davis took those influences and being Miles Davis just redefined them.
More than that, he shattered expectations.
Mm.
I mean, look at his different albums, how his sound changed. He never stuck to just one thing, always experimenting, pushing the limits, always working with other amazing musicians who were on the same wavelength. It wasn't like an overnight thing, though, more like a gradual evolution.
Our sources mention this early fusion period of his with albums like Phyllis to Kilimanjaro and In a Silent Way, both from the late 60s. What was it about those albums that hinted at what was to come?
Well, in those albums, he starts using electric instruments a lot more. Electric piano, guitar, they bring in these new textures, new timbres that were pretty out there in the jazz world back then. And he's also moving away from the traditional way of doing chord progressions. He's exploring more of a modal approach, creating this spacious, almost atmospheric sound.
You mentioned the modal approach. Kind of Blue, that masterpiece of his, that was a landmark modal jazz album. So was he drawing on that experience for this new sound?
Oh, absolutely. He was building on what he'd done before, but taking it in a much bolder direction. And then 1970, Bitches Brew.
Yeah.
And jazz was never the same. I mean, that wasn't just an album. It was like a cultural earthquake.
Bitches Brew is often seen as the jazz fusion album. Why was it so revolutionary back then?
Well, the production was groundbreaking, for one. He worked with this producer, Teo Machero, and they used these really innovative recording techniques, editing techniques. It created a sound experience that was completely different from anything in jazz before. They were using multi-tracking, overdubbing to build these layers of sound, and they weren't afraid to experiment with effects, electronic effects, and studio manipulation. And what you got was this dense, almost psychedelic sound. It was mesmerizing and challenging.
So it wasn't just the music, but how it was made that broke new ground. And it also blended jazz with psychedelic rock, funk, even hints of world music. Was that unusual for that time?
Oh, it was incredibly daring. He had this big ensemble, multiple keyboards, guitars, percussion, and you can hear it all, the psychedelic rock influence in those long improvisations, the funk and the rhythms. You can even hear hints of Eastern African music in some of the patterns, melodic and rhythmic. It was this really eclectic mix. You couldn't put it in a box.
And this wasn't just something for the studio. Davis took this on the road. His live shows were legendary. Albums like Live Evil, Little Church, they capture some of that energy. What made those shows so special, do you think?
Well, Davis was an amazing band leader, and the musicians he played with, they were incredibly talented, and he gave them this freedom to improvise, to interact with each other spontaneously. Those shows, they were electric with these extended jams, improvisations that could go anywhere. It was risky, but that's what made it so exciting. Little Church, that one's so powerful. Beautiful, moving piece inspired by a funeral he went to. It really shows you the emotional range that jazz fusion could have.
It's amazing that this is music that seems so experimental, so avant-garde. It can also be so personal, so emotional.
That's the beauty of it. Davis didn't just push boundaries musically. He pushed boundaries emotionally, too. He wasn't afraid to be vulnerable, to express raw emotion through his music. And he kept going, kept experimenting all through the 70s. Pushed jazz fusion even further with albums like Tribute to Jack Johnson, On the Corner, Get Up With It. What do you think about these later albums?
Tribute to Jack Johnson is amazing. It's so raw, almost punk in its energy.
Yeah.
The way he blends jazz with funk and rock, it's totally different from Bitches Brew. On the Corner is even more experimental. I mean, there's avant-garde in there. Even noise music. I remember reading he used tape loops and stuff to create textures that were really unusual for jazz back then. And Get Up With It. It's this sprawling, eclectic album that's got everything from soulful ballads to extended funk jams. And there's even that 30-minute organ solo on He Loved Him Madly.
Yeah. That's Davis. Always restless, searching for new sounds, new ways to express himself.
Yeah.
He never let genres, or what critics might say, limit him.
It's pretty incredible. One musician, so prolific, so influential. After going through all these albums, I mean, how do you define jazz fusion? It's even harder now.
Right. It's almost impossible to pin down. Our sources say maybe it's more of a philosophy, a way of approaching music, than a strict genre. It's about freedom, improvisation, pushing the limits. And Davis, he totally embodied that.
Yeah, it's a mindset, not a set of rules. Like saying, okay, jazz is about breaking the rules. Let's break even more rules.
Exactly. And that impact, it went way beyond Miles Davis. He opened the door for so many musicians to experiment, blend genres, express themselves, no limitations. You can still feel his influence today in jazz and in other genres too.
So we've been talking about the legacy of jazz fusion, the lasting impact of Miles Davis. What a journey. But before we wrap up, let's step back. How did all this change music? What were the ripple effects of this sonic earthquake?
Well, for one thing, it really challenged the idea of what jazz could be. Before fusion, people often thought of jazz as either traditional, nostalgic, or super intellectual avant-garde.
You mean like the bebop of Charlie Parker or the free jazz of Ornette Coleman?
Exactly. But Davis showed that jazz could be both popular and experimental, accessible, but also challenging. He kind of bridged the gap between different audiences and expanded what the genre could be.
What about his influence on other genres? Was there a fusion wave in other types of music?
Absolutely. Jazz fusion had a big impact on rock, funk, even electronic music. Musicians from all these different genres, they were inspired by how Davis used electric instruments, his approach to improvisation, his willingness to mix styles. You can hear echoes of his sound in Jimi Hendrix, Herbie Hancock, even some electronic music producers today.
It's wild to think his music had such a reach. Like he planted a seed that just blossomed in all these unexpected ways.
Really is. It shows the power of innovation, creativity,
Yeah.
and just being willing to challenge the status quo.
We've covered a lot in this deep dive. The basics of jazz, the revolutionary sounds of Miles Davis, the impact of jazz fusion. Before we wrap up, though, I want to get your thoughts on the lasting legacy of this movement. What is it about jazz fusion that still speaks to musicians and audiences today? So we ended on this question of legacy. What is it about jazz fusion that still resonates today?
I think it's that fearlessness, that willingness to explore, to innovate that Davis had. He showed everyone music doesn't have to fit in these neat little boxes. It can be complex, challenging, but still, deeply moving and engaging.
Yeah. And he proved that jazz, it wasn't stuck. It could move forward, adapt, bring in new influences, but without losing that core of improvisation.
Right. Jazz fusion, it opened up so many possibilities, not just for jazz musicians, but for artists, period. It encouraged this mixing of ideas, breaking down those walls between styles.
And that collaboration aspect, it's still huge in jazz fusion today.
Totally. Contemporary jazz fusion artists are still pushing, incorporating hip-hop, electronic music, world music, anything that speaks to them. The genre, it's never static, always evolving, looking for ways to surprise you, challenge you.
That's what makes it exciting. There's always something new, a different sound, a new approach, a new way to blend things.
Keeps you on your toes, challenges your expectations. It's not just background music, it grabs your attention, makes you think, makes you feel.
Our sources also talk about how important improvisation is in this music. It's not just about chops, it's about communication, like a conversation between the musicians happening right there.
That's what gives it that raw energy, that spontaneity. You never know what's coming next. Every performance, it's unique. It exists only in that moment.
It's kind of like a magic trick, watching them create something from nothing, building on each other's ideas, taking risks, pushing each other.
Yeah, it reminds you that music is alive. It's not static. It's in motion, always changing.
Brings us back to Miles Davis, the one who sparked this whole transformation.
His legacy is huge. Not just the music he created, but how he inspired so many others to think differently.
He showed everyone it's okay to break the rules, experiment, find your own way, even if it takes you somewhere totally new.
And that's the real heart of jazz fusion, right? That freedom to create, innovate, to push the boundaries of what music can even be.
So we've gone deep on jazz fusion, but as we wrap up, I want to leave you with this. If jazz is all about breaking rules, can any music really be outside of jazz?
That's a good question. Makes you rethink how we define genres, how we think about creativity. Maybe the beauty of jazz fusion is that there are no limits, just infinite possibilities.
I hope this deep dive made you want to explore jazz fusion for yourself. Check out those albums we mentioned, find some new artists, get lost in this music. You might just find it opens up a whole new way of hearing, a whole new way of experiencing the world.